I was going to say it's quite a while since I've stood up here and done this for one reason or another, but then I thought if I did that, somebody would probably say that it's not quite long enough. And so I'm not going to say that. But I'm going to start off just with a little story. One of the things about having a large family, Jan and I had 4 children. We've got 4 adults now, but we did have 4 children. And one of the things about having a large family is that it gets quite difficult if you want to have a day out. Apart from having to marshal them and everything, get them all in the car and all that business, it gets quite expensive. I'm sure Ben and Katie will relate to this, but one of the things you find is all the family tickets, they don't let 6 people in. They let 4 people in or maybe 5 people in, but they don't let 6 people in. So because of that, when our kids were younger, we didn't in the holidays we didn't particularly go out to events and that much, and it was a good thing in some ways because they learnt to entertain themselves. But one year, I was thinking it would be really nice if we could all go out as a family, and this was in the school holidays, and I think it was probably 98 or 99, sometime around then, and I was wondering what we could do, and then I realised that I'd built up quite a lot of air miles from trips abroad from work. And so I thought, great. So I got out, never really looked in the Air Miles book before, but I got out the Air Miles book. I thought, what can you do with these? And I found out that you could go to Legoland. Well, Legoland, had been really beyond our reach to take 6 of us there. It's quite expensive. But I thought, great. So school holidays, I booked the day off work, and we planned to go down to Legoland. And there was great excitement. Everybody was really excited about this. Jan and I were pleased we were going. The kids were really excited. Got into the car, headed off down the M40, and we just sort of started our journey. And this was in middle of summer, but it started to rain. And it didn't just rain, it absolutely chucked it down to the extent where you couldn't really see where you're going on the motorway. And at that point, I started to feel under quite a lot of pressure, really, because, the kids were still excited. They hadn't noticed it was raining. The kids were still excited. And I'm thinking, this is not going to work very well. And just praying that it would stop. And I was thinking in the back of my head, well, what else can we do? I was thinking, there's Windsor Castle down that way, And anyway, it just continued to rain. And it rained all the way there, and we got into this car park. And if you've ever been to Legoland, there's these huge, there's several really big car parks, and we pulled into the car park, and I think there was one, all these car parks, there was one other car there in the middle of the school holidays. The other people had clocked the rain. And anyway, I thought, well, what do we do now? We put our anoraks on, got out the car, and almost the instant we got out the car, it stopped. And the sun came out. I thought, well, that's not bad. And we went into Legoland, and there was all this. As you went in, there were all these barriers for the queues. Well, we didn't have to bother with those at all. We just walked straight through, and we went on to the first ride, and all the rides there were these long snaking barriers, and there was these notices, and it says, half an hour to go or an hour to go or whatever, So you pretty well picked up that most people, it was normal to have to wait. Maybe half an hour or 3/4 of an hour just to get on the ride. Well, we didn't have to do that. There was hardly anybody. There was almost nobody else there. And so the kids, they just go on the ride and they run back to the beginning and they go on again and they run around again, and they had a really great time. And basically, there were no restrictions. There was nothing. There was nothing to stop them, nothing to stop that access to those rides. Now we'll get back to that later in the talk, but just hold on to that thought for a moment. So today we're going to be talking. Wendy started us off last week talking about Prayer Unlimited, and Wendy did a great job of giving us an overview of that. And today we're going to take it sort of in a particular area, and this talk is about unlimited access. And really, to me, prayer is about that access to being in God's presence, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I want to start off by looking a little bit at some of the book of Esther. And Esther's a great book. If you haven't dipped into it recently, if you haven't read it, do have a look at it. It doesn't take very long to read, probably about 20 minutes. And I'm told it's probably the best among the Jewish community. It's probably the best known book. They really love the story of Esther. And so just to give you a bit of background for those who haven't read it for a while, the story of Esther is it's set about 460 BC, and it concerns Esther, who is a Jew living in the Persian Empire, and this is just a little bit after the Jews were exiled into Babylon. This is a little bit after they've returned back to Babylon. And they returned basically because Persia, I think it was Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon, and at that time the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. But quite a few still remained, if you like, as aliens in Persia. And Esther was one of those. And she was in fact an orphan, and she was brought up by her cousin Mordecai. And through a sort of unusual set of circumstances, she ended up becoming queen. And the king at the time was a guy called Xerxes. And Xerxes was a very powerful king. And if we just have a look, if I can make this work, there we go. That gives you an idea of his empire. It actually included part of India as well, so it's quite a huge empire. And he was known to be a harsh king. So whereas before the Persian kings had ruled their empires with quite a light touch, Xerxes wasn't like that. He was so he was a feared king, really. So Esther became queen, and that was fine. But after a little while, Xerxes appointed a guy called Haman to be one of his chief advisors. And Haman didn't like the Jews, and he concocted a plot to basically to do ethnic cleansing, to kill a lot of the Jews. And her cousin, Mordecai, decided to enlist Esther's help in trying to persuade the king not to let this plot go ahead. And he contacted Esther, and Esther was at first very nervous. And the reason she was nervous was because it wasn't normal for the queen, for anybody, to be able to approach the king without permission. And this is what Esther said when she was asked. If I can make this work, I'm pointing it the wrong way, aren't I? There we go. So when Esther was asked to approach the king, she was really concerned, and this is what she said. She said, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." So Esther was really nervous about approaching the king to plead their cause. She was basically afraid for her life. And her cousin, Mordecai, said, "If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place." So he was saying, God will look after us. "But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to this royal position for just such a time as this." So he was saying, you've been put in this privileged position so that you can go and plead our case. And so this was Esther's decision. She said, "Okay, go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me." So she was asking for their support. "Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my attendant will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So she was prepared to risk her life to go and see the king and plead the cause of the Jews who are under peril. And so after 3 days, she approached the king. And this is what happened. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. And so she'd done a really risky thing. She was approaching the king, and that was genuinely was a really risky thing to do. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. And when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out his golden scepter that was in his hand. So that's what she was praying, that's what she was hoping for. So he welcomed her in. So essentially her life was saved. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and that's what allowed her to see the king. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to the kingdom, half the kingdom, it will be given to you, if it pleases the king." If it pleases the king, replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther has prepared. And the story goes on from there to tell how Haman's plot to kill the Jews is exposed, and the Jews are allowed to live, and Haman meets a sticky end. So that's a great story, and that really reminds us there's an obvious parallel there between Esther and her access to the king and our access to God. But of course it's not quite like that now, is it? We have a different type of access to God. If we go back perhaps to the Old Testament and look, what was the situation there in terms of entering God's presence? Well, of course, right at the very beginning, Adam could walk in the garden with God. There was a close, very easy access there. But after Adam and Eve sinned, that access was no longer available, and so God put in place a mechanism. But that mechanism was far from perfect, really, as far as we're concerned. So what you had was the tabernacle, which had the holy place, and then it had the most holy place where the ark sat. And once a year, the priest could gain entrance to that most holy place. So nobody else but the priest could go, and he couldn't go more than once a year. And when he did go, he had to do everything right. And in fact, it's Jewish tradition that when the priest entered the most holy place on that one time a year, he'd go with a rope tied around his ankle. And do other people know this story? What was the rope for? To pull him out. That's right, to pull him out. Because if he did things wrong when he entered that most holy place before God, then he'd die, and there would be no way of getting him out. So he went with a rope attached to him. So well, yes, I couldn't have put it better myself. So it was a really serious business, and that's what access was like. That was what our access to God was like in those times. So our access is quite different. Our access is quite different because of what Jesus has done. And the thing I should have mentioned there was what was separating the holy place from the most holy place was a curtain, and also known as the veil. And in fact, the veil the word veil actually comes from the word to separate. It was there to separate the holy place from the most holy place where God dwells. So there's this real separation, if you like, this real barrier that prevented us fully or easily accessing God. It wasn't unlimited access by any means. So, what happened when Jesus came? Sorry, this is what we've just talked about here. So I'm not doing very well with this. Can we go back? Okay, so that's what we were just talking about. That was only priests could enter the most holy place. Now if we go one forward. Okay. What happened when Jesus died on the cross? And I think these slides have got mixed up, so never mind. When Jesus died on the cross, it says that when he gave up his life, that curtain that hung in the temple, by this time the curtain had been moved to the temple, and that curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. Now that, when we think of the veil, we might think of, I don't know, I think I used to think of it as like a little net curtain with one of those frilly things on the top. It wouldn't take a lot of tearing. In fact, the curtain that separated those two places in the temple was apparently about 70 foot high, and get this, it was about 4 inches thick. It was the thickness of a man's hand. That's like trying to tear a telephone directory in half, isn't it? It's not something that's going to just fall apart. And that tearing of the curtain was an incredibly significant event. It was, all the people would have known what that meant. They were used to having this barrier that separated them from the most holy place. They were used to not having that unlimited access. And yet when Jesus was crucified on the cross, that was torn in two. And it was torn from top to bottom. If you get the impression that, that's from God to man. It was torn in two. And it says, if you read in Acts later on, many priests went on to become Christians. And I think that's one of the reasons. They were so impressed by that happening. So that's just a bit of a background as to how, what God did and how we have gained that unlimited access to God. And it's not only that we were, that curtain, it was, people have said it allowed us to enter the holy place, but it was also God coming out to be amongst his people. It was also God releasing his Spirit. Today's actually Pentecost, I don't know if you realised. But, that ripping of the curtain was also God coming out of the most holy place to be in amongst us. So we're in a very different position now as Christians. We're in that position where we do actually have that unlimited access into God's presence. But there's two sides. There's another side to this. There's another side to all communication. Jan and I used to do a lot of sort of marriage education work, and we're often talking about communication. And obviously, one of the things about communication is it goes two ways. If you phone somebody up, if nobody had ever invented the second telephone, it wouldn't have been a lot of use, would it? So it's a two-way thing. So God has given us that unlimited access to him. But how does it work the other way? Do we take advantage of that access? And let me just see if I can get this working again. No? Can we go on a few slides? No, never mind. Yes, exactly what I wanted. Yeah. By coincidence, we have this picture. Now, I know we've spoken about this picture before a long time ago. This is Michelangelo's creation of Adam. And it hasn't come out very well, but what you can see there is God reaching over to reach to Adam. And one of the points about that picture is that if you look here, you can see that Adam isn't really making that much effort, is he? He's sort of like, oh, God is really stretching out. He's almost about to fall out of heaven, it looks like. And God is determined to make that contact. And Adam really looks a little bit half-hearted about it all. And sometimes that's how it is with us. We've got this tremendous unlimited access to God, and yet we're not really taking advantage of it. And I think part of the problem is that we all have some things that get in the way. We all have some barriers that stop us really taking advantage, stop us moving into God's presence. So what are some of those barriers? Well, one of them you often hear people talk about is not really feeling good enough, not feeling as though we're worthy to move into the presence of God, to be in that holy place. And of course, in one sense that's true, but we know that on the cross Jesus dealt with that. We know that that's not, that God has put aside our sin and allows us to come directly into the presence of God. Another barrier that we see is people just being too busy. Life today really is just too busy. People feel they haven't got the time to just sit down, and maybe they lack the motivation as well. Some people feel they don't know what to say. They don't know how to get started. There's doubt and unbelief. Sometimes you feel, well, if I pray, I'm being hypocritical because I don't really quite believe, I don't fully believe what I'm asking for. I don't fully believe that God is there listening to me. Distraction, that's another barrier. That's a huge barrier nowadays. We're continually distracted. We're distracted by all the things going on around us. We're distracted by our busy lives. We're distracted by technology all the time. We can't really go anywhere nowadays where we're not bombarded with images. We're not bombarded with noise. It's easy for our mind to wander into other things. And sometimes we don't feel close to God. We don't feel as if he's there. We don't feel close enough to him. So we have these barriers that get in our way, that stop us entering that presence of God, that stop us really taking advantage of that unlimited access that God has put there for us, that Jesus died for. So what can we do about that? Well, there's an awful lot being written about this. Look, everybody, I think, finds prayer difficult. And there's almost like two sides to this thing. On the one hand, there's changing our behaviour, being more disciplined, having more self-control, setting aside time. And if you go into a Christian bookshop, you can just read acres of things about how to make your prayer life better by applying yourself better, by getting up early, by being more disciplined. And all of those things, they really have their place if we're serious about entering the presence of God. We need to take it seriously. We need to put effort into it. But I really believe there's another side to this that we miss sometimes. And that's about our attitude. And I just want to go back to that story at the beginning about going to Legoland. And when I was thinking about this talk, in my mind, I kept coming back to that image. And I remember my kids going to those rides where they had unlimited access, totally unlimited. And they'd go to those rides and they'd get on the log flume or whatever it was, and they'd have a great time. They'd run around and they'd do it again. And what was the overwhelming sort of emotion that was coming out of that? Well, it was joy. It was joy. They were just so pleased to have unlimited access. That was, it was great. And I think that joy, in many ways, is an antidote to all these barriers that we see. I think if we really grab hold of that of what happened, if we think back to how things used to be, how we were, how mankind did not have access, how it had to be through a third person, and it was once a year, and it was a take your life in your hands thing. And we look what Jesus has done for us. We look how we now have unlimited access, and that how pleased God is for us to be in his presence, how much he wanted us, how he was reaching out like on that picture. Then I think that changes our attitude. It's a bit like, I don't know if your children are the same, or certainly I was when I was a kid. I wasn't always that enthusiastic about going to school. I didn't wake up on a Monday morning really rooting for those lessons to start. But if you look at some children in more underdeveloped countries where they've not had the opportunity to go to school, they will walk miles. They will get up really early. They're delighted to go to school because they know what it means and they've remembered what it means. And I think we need to get that back. We need to get back that joy so that we can't help ourselves but want to be in the presence of God. So next time you're thinking, next time you're sitting down to pray and you're thinking, I'm not worthy, or I'm too busy, or I'm not sure, that I really believe enough, or whatever it is that's getting in the way of your prayer, just think back to that. I wonder if I can make it come up. There we go. Enter God's presence with joy. Think of Legoland. And you can see just how happy those Legoland people are there, can't you? But yes, just remember, it's a joyful thing that we have that unlimited access.